can sometimes feel like a lot, but you don't have to do it alone. I strongly believe that we're stronger together. Here, we're going to slow down, have real talks, make sense of things together, and explore ways to intentionally grow the life you want. We're going to talk about mental and physical health, relationships, money, work, and community. Welcome to Rooted in Intention with me, Karina Gomez. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining for another episode. In this one, we're going to be diving into burnout and how to get to the other side of burnout using holistic healing approaches. And I'm joined by a special guest, Maria Cristina Guzman, who's a psychiatric nurse practitioner and a holistic coach. So, Maria, thank you so much for joining me today. And to get us started, can you share a little bit about your story and what brought you into the work that you're doing today?
Thank you for having me, Karina. I really appreciate it. So, as you mentioned, I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and I decided to specialize in psychiatry because I saw the need in my community. And when I was doing my residency up north in Santa Rosa, California, I found myself with a different population in different resources because I was used to working in Southern California, mostly border towns like San Isidro, Chula Vista, National City. And we had a lot of resources for our population, for our community. Particularly, I love serving monolingual Spanish speaking patients because, I am bilingual in Spanish and so I can communicate with them. And so when I was up there, the resources were limited. And I found myself in a new role. I've been a nurse for 18 plus years. And in this new role as a psychiatric nurse practitioner, I was actually, in the exam room, so to speak, diagnosing and treating, coming up with a treatment plan with the patients. And so I noticed that a lot of our community, I knew that we don't like taking medications, that we like kind of holistic approaches, but I just did not know the percentage of my community that does not like taking medications. It was a big chunk.
Mhm.
It was a big percentage. And so when I found myself asking, what are we going to do with this, right? Because in the particular organization I worked for, the goal was to diagnose and treat with psychotropic medications,
Mm.
coming up with a new way of serving this community who does not want medications was not part of the goals at the time, as far as I was aware. And so to me, that was frustrating. It was frustrating because this is why I went to school. This is why I decided to specialize in psychiatry to help them because I saw the need. And so when I found myself telling them, you have to go back to your primary care provider, as I was instructed to do. To me, it just seemed like we were not serving them the way they want to be served, and also the idea of them receiving quality care was unattainable. Because I don't know if many people know this, but I think it's important for them to know that a primary care provider in a community clinic setting is expected to see 4 patients in an hour.
Mhm.
That is for patients to assess, diagnose, treat, write the note, not to mention any coordination of care, to ensure quality of care, right? So when it comes to serving those patients in need of psychiatric services, when they go back to the primary care provider, to me seems like an unattainable goal. And so that's when I realized, okay, I need to do something else because I don't feel like I am doing the best I can in this role. And so I need to do something that will help my community heal in a culturally resonant manner. Because you see, in school and even in organizations that I work, they talk a lot about culturally sensitive care, but they don't really teach us or give us an actionable to-do list. This is how you provide culturally sensitive care. So to me, it just seems rhetoric versus, actionable to-dos. And I am a person who likes actionables. And so that's why I decided to embark on this journey. And I ended up focusing on burnout. So that's kind of like the summary of it.
Yeah, and I imagine that that was super frustrating of being in those environments where like I could see the pain, I could see the need, and
Hmm.
I don't have the right resources or we can't function in, like you said, that culturally resonant manner that's actually going to click with people. And can you share a little bit of those general things that people were coming in for and that were being prescribed medication? I'm imagining it's things like depression,
Hmm.
anxiety.
Yeah, so I saw a lot of patients with trauma, anxiety, depression. Those are like the major diagnoses that I would document. But as far as those that did not want medications, it's like all of the above, you
Mm,
know. Um, Particularly, I want to mention what really struck my heartstrings was trauma. Because you see, trauma, I would see a lot of female Latinas, Hispanas, not to mention that men don't have trauma, right? Not to say that they don't have trauma, because I believe they do, but they just are less likely to ask for help. And so when I found myself in the provider's room, diagnosing them and coming up with a plan of care when it comes to trauma, there's no medication to treat trauma. You see, there's medications to treat those comorbid conditions that typically come associated with trauma, such as depression, anxiety, sleeping problems, ADHD, but there is no actual medication to fix trauma. The evidence-based treatment for trauma is something called EMDR,
mm,
eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And the frustrating part on my end was that I did not have a provider in-house to refer the patients to. There were no providers even outside of the organization I worked for. And another layer or another barrier to access to care is the fact that the patients that had built a trusting relationship with me did not want to go out and see another provider. And so they don't train us to be EMDR specialists. Typically, it's a psychologist or a therapist that is trained on this. And so I took it upon myself to further my education and enroll in and become EMDR trained.
and for those people that might not be familiar with EMDR, can you share a little bit more about EMDR? And I know before this podcast, we talked a little bit about the schooling that you did and some of the
Mm-hmm.
holistic approaches. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it was in New Mexico. In New Mexico, they offer a course in curanderismo, which I am going to go in person this summer, June 1st to 3rd, to take those courses in person. But I took a course online. It's facilitated through Coursera. And so it was in the process that I was taking the curanderismo course, and then I enrolled in EMDR, that I realized the tool that is used for both of them is the same. It's something called bilateral stimulation. And there was even in this handbook that I had for EMDR that they provided us with, it stated something about the tool being used, for hundreds of years by Native Americans, through their singing, their dancing, drum playing. And so that's why I became intrigued. And then having learned the kind of ritual practice for treating susto, what we call
Mm,
susto in curanderismo, I realized, oh my gosh, it's the same, and this is something that our ancestors have been practicing, probably for millennia.
mm,
And so I decided to just go and learn more about ancestral healing techniques, more about my heritage, about my lineage, my ancestors. And what I found was just mind blowing, the Aztecs and the Toltecs. And so that's how that kind of became, from just focusing on trauma, but rather doing coaching for burnout. Because burnout can become exhaustion if it's not treated, And I just recently did some additional reading. Those who reach the point of exhaustion where you can't control your body, right? Because your body tells you this is it, this is how far I've gone. You've abusing my body, so I'm not gonna work no more. And they could lose 4 to 6 months of work. They go on disability, they go on leave of absence. On average, the average American loses $60,000 a year for an episode of Burnout. Sorry, I went on a tangent. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. It was so good. And I have so many questions come up, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
okay, how do I focus on one thing? I think one of the things that would be helpful is can you share a little bit more of what the connection be between burnout and trauma?
Let me preface by saying that there's not a lot of research done, particularly on the niche that I am focusing on, which is first gens. And I decided to do that because being first gen graduate myself, I can empathize with the challenges that we face, right? We don't have a roadmap, we don't have a blueprint. We have to figure everything ourselves, right? It's like going into battle to any new situation that we face, right? Whether that's navigating college, navigating your first job, navigating healthcare for your parents at a young age. So all of that can influence, can exacerbate trauma. Trauma, there's this whole field of epigenetics that talks about how trauma is not just does not start the day you are born. Trauma can be passed down from generation through gene expression. And, trauma, sometimes you don't remember it. And so I'll tell you what I found, right? This is no formal research whatsoever, but this is what I found because prior to embarking on this journey, I decided to take a marketing course. And in this marketing course, the consultant told me, you need to do a survey of the people that you're going to serve because, that way you'll learn to speak their language, right? Because I speak, the medical terminology, but then, people who are not trained in medicine or don't have that medical background verbalize these things differently, right? And so one of the first things I did was I asked patients who face trauma in my private practice, which I have in Arizona. But that became something totally new as soon as I got the information back from the survey. And so this is the question I asked. The question was, when unresolved trauma or susto shows up in your professional or personal life today, how does it most commonly manifest? And I surveyed 100 people, and the findings to me were pretty mind blowing because it was something that I had not learned in school, right? I didn't learn this in nursing school, I didn't learn this in psych and P school. And so this is what I learned. This was an open ended question, by the way. And so they could write a paragraph, and I summarized it and synthesized it and came up with a total of 5 categories. Those were the most common answers, and one of them being hyper independence. Hyper
Mm.
independence is a person who feels like they have to do everything themselves because they can't truly trust others to do it right. I also notice a pattern, by the way. This
Mm.
typically tends to be in our population, the firstborn female or the only female, right? Because the roles we have in our culture, the Latino culture, are different, right? For men versus female. And then also, we tend to be people pleasing. But you see, it's not because we truly like that person, we want them to like us, we want to be best friends. But there's this underlying inability to say no or
Mm.
set boundaries, which inevitably leads to resentment and burnout. And what I hear over and over again with people, someone I spoke with told me that, she's like, I became a token Latina. I became the person my boss would come to because I would always say yes. But you see, I think this is also because our only point of reference for us first gens prior to going into the workforce is our family. And in our family, we are taught to respect our elders, right?
Mhm.
If you say no, sometimes it's considered disrespectful. And so you find yourself doing the same thing when you go into the workforce as the first gen, right? That's your only point of reference. And so you don't know how to say no, or you think it's disrespectful to say no and set boundaries. And so then fast forward 3 months or a year later, you find yourself with all these items on your plate and you look around and your coworkers don't have as much as you do. Inevitably, that leads to resentment and of course burnout, right? Because by the time you get back home, and I hear this over and over again from single young ladies, they're like, dating what dating, right? They don't even have any desire to date. If they're married, couples, male, female, they're like, by the time I get home, I'm exhausted. I just
Mhm.
want to like pass out on the couch, and so there's no quality time that you spend with your family. And you see, this is a vicious cycle because we need to rest, right? We need to enjoy our life, even if it's a couple of minutes, some quality time with your family. So that's the other category. And then the third one is the always on mode. This always on mode, I also call it the biggest thief of our joy, because you
Mhm.
see, people find themselves, first gens, we find ourselves feeling always on alert, always anxious and tense, even when things are going well. You know, I hear this particularly from parents. By the time they get home, or when there's like a little event, a little win to celebrate, or a big win, they don't celebrate it because they're so focused on the past, right?
Mhm.
Things that happened in the past, they ruminate on it. And then they're fearful of the future, that the same thing that happened in the past that is unresolved will happen in the future. And so they don't celebrate or live the day by day, the today, the now, the present, right? The other category is the success as a shield. That success as a shield is, for example, using productivity and busyness to avoid sitting with difficult emotions or memories.
Mhm.
I can also identify with this when it comes to just like adding degrees to your name. I feel like for the longest time I just kept adding degrees, but there was no clear finality to it. There was no objectivity to it. It was the object was so that I could get a higher degree,
Mhm.
because it was almost like a sign of worthiness, right? The higher the degree I have, the more worthy I become, not knowing that I am just unworthy just by being. Or also other people do this, they add to their list because they avoid silence. They avoid silence because you see, silence is soothing, silence is healing, because it forces you, when it's just you and your thoughts, it forces you to process those memories, those painful memories, right? And so if you're not ready to face them, you're just okay, like I'm just gonna go in and go get the next degree or go add to my to-do list. And then finally is the impatience reactivity. That one, also ties to burnout, because you're the one at work, right, who has all these things on their plate. You become frustrated, you become burned out, and then by the time you get home, you get easily triggered by small things, right? And I always give the example to my clients. It's like by the time you get home, because you're so exhausted, your patience is like this big, right? Like tiny, tiny. And so
Mhm.
you get upset at little things like, the children fighting, but they're children, like that's what they do. Siblings do that. Or the dog barking. Well, the dog is a dog and it barks, right? Or your partner's tone of voice, and so those are the five items that I noticed. And so when you look at one specifically, right? Like let's take for example hyper independence, right? You would think, oh, well, that's just kind of like a character trait, right? That's their personality. They feel like they have to do everything themselves because they can't truly trust others to do it right. But you see, the underlining, the root cause of that is the trauma. Because if we go back, just to remind the audience of the question that I asked was, when unresolved trauma or susto shows up in your professional life or personal life today, how does it most commonly manifest? And the people that answered this survey, the majority of them were actually people that had already been diagnosed by trauma. They had tried or were currently with a therapist or taking medications. And so I'm very glad that I did this, because this led me to decide, you know what, I'm going to focus on burnout, because all of these categories, if you continue doing them long enough, right, you will inevitably burn out. That burnout, if you don't treat it, it will inevitably lead to exhaustion.
Mhm.
I talk with a lot of young women in their 20s. Sometimes, a lot have been affected by something called Bell's palsy, which looks like they had a stroke.
Mhm.
In fact, I've talked with a couple that like half their face is like crooked,
Mhm.
but there's remnants of the Bell's palsy, and it's because they were burned out for such a long time. And they admitted this to me, right? Because when I meet with people, sometimes I have cafecito with people, and I would like to invite anyone to have cafecito with me. And I just love to learn about their experience with burnout. And this is what people have been telling me because I want to learn how to better serve this community to help them heal in a culturally resonant manner. And that's what I've learned thus far. I'm sure there's a lot that I still don't know, but I am committed to this.
Yeah, I think the work that you did with the survey to really hear from
Hmm.
people what their experience felt like to them, I think
Hmm.
is such important work because I think that's one of the things that still makes mental health a little bit inaccessible to people is just the
Mm.
language of Western medicine, the
Oh,
mental health field. It doesn't
yes.
quite click. And it's interesting because I went down my own learning of attachment theory. And then once I started talking to my
Hmm.
mom, so my mom only speaks Spanish. So I really had to
Hmm.
digest the information and talk about like apegos and the experiences of the different attachment theories. And when I broke things down to her, like immediately she knew, she's like, oh, I resonate like with this apego. And it
Hmm.
wasn't until I broke that down, she probably wasn't going to learn about attachment theory beforehand. But when I shared in a manner that was more digestible and in her language, she was just like, oh yes, that's definitely something that I resonate with. And that's why I think the survey that you did is going to be so helpful for people to see themselves of like, oh yes, this could be
Yeah.
something that I might be struggling with because what you were saying around burnout and underlying trauma, I think that was definitely
Mm.
my experience. And for me, it took having extreme exhaustion where I was just like, I need help. Like I don't
Yeah.
know how to carry all of this. And then once I started working with a therapist, it was just a lot of unresolved trauma, childhood trauma,
Right.
in addition to current things that are happening as well that are
Hmm.
just kind of piling one on top of another.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I can also resonate as you were talking about your personal experience. I remembered, one of the most challenging times of my life was when my husband was diagnosed with a cancer, melanoma. It's skin cancer, and just helping him navigate, even as a healthcare provider, right? Navigating the healthcare system, it is so upsetting, It's like my husband is a very smart man. He has a PhD, okay? And sometimes he goes to the pharmacy and they talk to him in this like foreign language and he calls me and he's like, I don't know what they said. What do you mean you don't know what they said? He's like, they said this, and so I'm like going back and forth, and then he goes, well, you just talk to them 'cause I don't know, you guys speak a different language, and it's so true. It's just navigating this healthcare system is exhausting, and you add to that, you have a loved one who is seriously ill, right? So I was strong enough during that process as I was, being his support system, through the healing process, through his treatments. And then finally, once he got out of the woods, so to speak, it was almost like then I allow myself to relax, and it was then that just like my body was just like feeling very tired, exhausted, borderline depressed because I felt like so empty, like I could not feel any feelings,
Mhm.
and that's your brain. There's this theory called triune brain theory that talks about your reptilian brain, the brain that evolved 500 years ago. This reptilian brain is sometimes in order to protect you, it thinks it's protecting you, so it numbs you
Mhm.
you know. So sometimes I hear clients talk about, me siento entumida, I feel numb, me siento congelada, I feel frozen, me siento como zombie, I feel like a zombie, you know. Those are phrases that remind me, oh, this patient's reptilian brain has decided that, it's gonna numb because it thinks that it's in danger.
And
I
that's a
felt that
hard
once.
place to be in.
Yeah, it is definitely a hard place to be in, because you just don't feel at all. And sometimes it lasts longer than 2 weeks. And, you wanna, like for example, me, I called my primary care provider and I have an HMO. And HMOs are notorious for you first have to see your primary care provider so that you can see the specialist. And then it was like, well, I request Spanish because I feel comfortable with Spanish. I speak English fairly well, but I would rather meet with someone who speaks Spanish. And so they're like, oh yeah, the appointment will be in 6 months from now.
Oof.
Yeah, and I'm like, okay, well, good thing I don't think I'm that sick, right?
I'll just
Because
sit in this little pit by myself until then.
I know. But yeah, it's ridiculous how long that has to be. But just kind of going back to this burnout, this unresolved burnout, it could eventually become more serious things like, depression, anxiety, panic attacks. And so I am a strong believer in preventative care. And so that's why when I saw that data, I said, well, you know what? This is the way that I can help my people, first gens, which are the community that I identify with a lot because I think we have a lot of stressors, right? Where I hear this very common from other first gens. They're like, no me siento ni de aquí ni de allá. I
Mhm.
don't feel like I belong here or over there, right? Meaning sometimes you are too corporate for your family, right? They think that, te crees mucho, you're showing off, you think you're too good for us. We never say that, but that's the way they feel, right? It's not about us, it's about what they're thinking. And then also when we go in the work setting, being Latina in healthcare, I don't know if you can identify, but not just healthcare, being Latina for me in psychiatry, I found myself many times being the only one. And therefore, since I'm the only one who speaks Spanish, I would see a lot of the Spanish speaking patients. And so I would see trends that my other colleagues wouldn't see, right? I'm very glad that the things that I witnessed led me to this path because I feel, in a way, treating this burnout is preventative care to the exhaustion, number one, right? But number two, also like this worsening anxiety, which could lead to panic, right?
Mm.
And so I really love the work that I'm doing. I'm in the, beginning phases. I would call it like the neonatal phase, but I'm really loving it. And that's how I know that's what I'm meant to do. Because when you truly feel it deep in your bones, in every cell of your body, that this is what you're supposed to be doing and you're truly enjoying it, you can truly make a difference because you're doing it with passion and with love, of
Mhm.
course, for my community.
That's the
Yeah,
best motivator, like that love for the
absolutely.
community. Like, what are you wanting to be doing? Can you share a little bit more of what can those holistic healing practices look like?
Yeah. So I learned a lot about the Aztec tripartite philosophical framework, as well as the Toltec philosophical framework. They also hold the same belief as the Aztecs because, the Toltecs lived before the Aztecs. They're like ancestors of the Aztecs. So let me put it to you this way. This is why I loved when I started reading about the Aztec tripartite soul. A lot of theories that I read about, including the triunal brain theory, there's a polyvagal theory, there's affective theories that talk exactly about what the Aztecs wrote about in the codices that remain. So when I was reading about this triunal brain theory, it reminded me a lot of these other theories, and I realized that they were so smart. They had their blueprint down. And also, I want to share this story because I think it's important. When I was reading about particularly this Aztec tripartite soul philosophical framework, my husband, who is a college professor, he teaches political science. And this particular day that I happened to be reading, he had a book out there on Plato. And when I was reading this particular book, it was talking about how the Aztecs and Plato had a similar framework. Well, it's different. The Aztecs is it's more like science based, and Plato is more like ethical. And so he's teaching this philosophical framework to his students, his college students. Plato was like 300 years AD, and I think the Aztecs came up with it a couple thousand years before that. And so to me, that was amazing. It's like, hey, wow, the Aztecs came up with this way before Plato, but it's more focused on science. And so like I said, as I think back on the theories that I learned through Western medicine theory, I realized because I know that language, right? That the Aztecs were talking about the same thing. It's just different names, different terminology, of course, different language, but it's the same. And so this is what the tripartite soul framework entails. They believe that we have three souls, one that resides in our head, the tonali, and that one is, the critical thinking one, the one that receives light through our, top of our head, what we call la mollera.
Mm,
When we're little, that's open. And then there's another soul that resides in our heart, and that's the tejolia. And so that tejolia is all about connection, right?
mm,
This love, the sense of belonging. And then we have the soul that resides in our gut, in our liver, gut and liver. And that's the ixcholot. And that soul is the instinctual soul,
mm,
the protector, right? And so the healing that we do, that I do, that I practice with those that join me is a lot of somatic work. We use bilateral stimulation that we have been using for many, many thousands of years through singing, dancing, bilateral tapping, breath work, mindfulness exercises. And it's work in progress, I come up with like modern activities that we can do to practice those rituals that our
mm,
ancestors did in the past, but maybe in the present they might not be applicable, but we can do something more modern. And
mm,
so that's what I do with people. It's all about awareness. It's
mm,
all about being here in the present because we are so busy staying in the past. It's almost like whatever happened in the past, if it was susto, right? Um, it's frozen,
mm,
right? And you relive it over and over and over again. And so the somatic exercises help you get unstuck, help
mm,
warm up the frozen, and you bring it to the present, you work on it, and then you release this energy, this negative energy that no longer serves you, but rather it's on the way. It's keeping you from becoming that version of yourself that you're supposed to become, because our ancestors believe that everything is written in the stars,
mm.
that you already have a destiny, you have a gift that you're supposed to fulfill, and so that's kind of what I work on. That's kind of like a session would look like.
And I think as you're sharing all of this, two big things come to mind. One is I really appreciate you finding that intersection between what
Yeah.
you know within the Western medicine and
Hmm.
our old practices of healing, of finding
Hmm.
that connection, of being in love. And as I was hearing you talk about some of the things, I definitely see that piece of the cultural resonance because hearing you talk
Hmm.
about like the mollera and the susto, those were definitely things
Hmm.
that I grew up hearing, like, oh, don't do
Oh
this, like,
yeah.
se les va a caer la mollera.
Hmm.
I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about, I don't know if you grew up with this too, of like
Hmm.
cuidando la mollera.
No, not particularly about cuidando la mollera, but I do recall, a lot of talk amongst our elders, my mom, my grandma, talk about the importance of, yeah, like que se le cayó la mollera, and then they would tilt the child back and shake it. I mean, I don't recommend that. That's not, there's nothing scientific about that, but there may be, some cultural beliefs that they used to practice certain things back in the past. But just kind of thinking back, something that I do have experience in, and that's actually why I got really interested into this ancestral work, is because you see, I grew up in a little town in the middle of nowhere where my community and my family faced every barrier to access to care that you can think of, lack of resources, lack of money, lack of transportation. and it's safety issues, right? You don't go out. And so because of that, and just because of, I think COVID just facilitated this virtual learning, virtual teaching, virtual practicing, my services are all virtual right now. I am working on something in person where I can actually incorporate all those other things, like even using herbs para la limpia, what they call
Mm.
la barrida, because that in itself is bilateral stimulation. Like I remember going to the curandero because again, that was the only provider, the only healthcare that we had, and my mom would take me there, and I used to believe that it was a miracle that I'm alive, right? I have memories of me being so, so sick that I was hallucinating
Mm.
because I had such a high fever, and all my mom could do at that time was, put some cabbage on my forehead because there was no money. There was no pharmacy in the town, and so she put some cabbage on my forehead, and then she took me to the curandero, and the curandero did his ritual. And I think there is definitely more to it than just what people think it's folk medicine, because I think when people hear folk medicine, they think, oh, it's I don't know, maybe witchcraft or something like that, but definitely not something that is evidence based. But I think just because it's not evidence based, it doesn't mean that there is no healing power in it.
Mhm.
It's not evidence based because no one has studied it yet. You know,
Mhm.
that's what that means. And so, in kind of honoring my ancestors, honoring my mom, right? I decided to learn more about it. And as I learned more about it, when I took the EMDR course, and then also when I took the courses in curanderismo, I'm very glad that I did, because it is through that I'm learning more on how to incorporate culturally resonant practices in my holistic coaching.
Hearing you share all of this, it feels like even learning about like ancestral practices and the things that you grew up knowing as medicine, like getting a
Hmm.
limpia, having that cabbage on your head. It's almost a healing experience of like reconnecting with ourselves and like reconnecting with the past. Wondering, given all of that, given all of the learning that you've done and all of those aha moments, what have been some of the most powerful things that just really stuck with you?
I think it was the bilateral stimulation. Different cultures, practice it differently, but at the end of the day, it's like the same outcome, right? Healing. Healing is healing, and wherever you receive your healing from, it is okay, right? If it works for you, it's okay. In Western medicine, I was taught to always practice using evidence-based research, and I do that in my private practice. But in coaching, I am a little more open on the practices that I integrate, because I feel those that I serve are more open, to those limpias, right? And to the power of smudging, or the power of drum playing, the power of singing, the
Mhm.
power of dancing. All of those are healing, and all of those are natural, bilateral stimulation that we do. You know, I once read a book that stated, and I mind you, this is not evidence-based, right? It was just a book I read somewhere that was talking about how back in the old days, there was no such thing as trauma. I'm talking about, like, when we lived in caves, because like you would go out, right? You would go hunting or whatnot, and if you are being chased by, I don't know, a saber-toothed tiger, you're running, and it's this the running
Mm.
itself is natural, right? Bilateral stimulation, and so if you made it, great, right? You're not gonna have trauma because you treated yourself. If you didn't make it, well, your genes are not passed down,
You are
so
dead.
yeah, exactly. And so yeah, that was something that made me laugh, but it's true, right? Also, our modern lifestyle, right, is different. And so if we don't stay active, if we don't exercise, exercise itself is a great natural bilateral stimulation, right? Whether you're hitting the treadmill, whether you're going out running in the park, whether you're on, what is it called? Step master? Yeah, I personally don't like going to the gym. I'd rather do some work in nature. Nature itself is healing, you know. Going to hug a tree is so grounding. It could be a great grounding exercise. That is evidence-based.
Yeah.
Hugging a tree.
I was just talking to someone about how being out in nature can be so grounding, and I live in
Oh,
close proximity to the beach. So I love
yeah.
walking to the beach, taking my shoes off, and just like letting my feet sink into the sand. And that's such a grounding experience. So thank you, Christina, so much for sharing all of your insights and kind of marrying those two things together, Western
Mm-hmm.
medicine with ancestral practices. And for people today, what do you think is one thing that they can do, that they can practice to do some healing?
Okay, I will finish with this. The Aztecs had this philosophical point of view of the purpose of life being something they would call the flower, the song, in Xochitl, in Cuicatl, in Nahuatl. And so the flower being anything that has a life cycle, right? Anything beautiful, anything that is alive is beautiful, and it is born and then it dies, right? But the beautiful thing, or like our legacy, is any arts that we create. That's the song in Cuicatl. And you see, you can only create something when you are in that state where your souls are aligned, where what you think is what you feel in your heart, right? And what your gut feeling is telling you. And I think we have forgotten to feel our feelings, to trust that gut instinct. And a place where we can begin is number one, awareness, being here in the present and now. So I would say just 3 times a day, practice this. The first thing you do when you wake up, just put your palm of your hand to your chest and ask yourself, how am I feeling right now? Because a feeling is something you don't need to learn. It's something that you are born with, you know. And then in the afternoon, same thing. How am I feeling? What do I need? Do I need to take a deep breath? Sometimes even just doing that. And so I'll leave you with this, the double sigh. So this hopefully it makes sense to
Let's do
people.
it together.
Um, okay. So the double sigh when you're feeling really stressed, right? And I don't know, you have to do a presentation, someone made you mad, you're stressed, you're feeling anxious. The double sigh, see, our body is so wise that it knows. When you'll be crying for a long time and then you're relaxing, you do this like a double sigh.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah. So the goal of the double sigh breath work is to breathe in 80% of total lung capacity. So that's one long breath. Then hold that breath for a second. Then breathe the remaining 20%. And then exhale in a long 7 to 8 count. Okay. So I'll demonstrate.
Okay.
So first I'm going to exhale all the air out of my lungs. Then I'm going to breathe 80% lung capacity. Hold for a sec. Breathe in the remaining 20. Hold for a couple seconds and then exhale in a long 7 to 8 count like this. And then just breathe normally, even close your eyes and just notice what you notice. Sometimes it takes 3 breaths. So you can do it up to 3 times. And what I hear people who are not used to this, sometimes I hear them say things like, "Oh, I feel this tingling on my head." It just truly relaxes you. With that breath work, I've been able to relax some of my clients that come in like all stressed out, because of the burnout they feel from work. And if you keep up practicing that for like a month, you will notice a difference, and then practice it for 60 days. It becomes part of your daily life because sometimes that's all you need to help you calm, relax, and ground you in the here and now. Enjoy those beautiful moments. Even like, to me, just waking up is such a blessing, so grateful that I get to live one more day in this beautiful earth. Hug your
Yeah.
loved ones. By the way, hugging is also therapeutic.
Mm.
Hugging creates that love hormone oxytocin. So you love it's hug your loved one three
Mm.
times a day.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you so much for doing that demonstration. I think this is actually the first time that we do a demonstration on an episode. And even as I did that breath work with you, I already feel like
Yeah.
more grounded and more centered. And to what you're saying, that power of the pause and the breathing and just being like so present right now.
Yes, yes, that's the key, being in the here and now. But it's also important to take into consideration that there's a lot of generational trauma in our communities. And so our ancestors, our parents have been living in this survival mode for hundreds of years. Chances are, if our ancestors were living here in the Americas, they faced all of this colonization atrocities that happened. And so they had to, our ancestors had to work 10 times as hard, right? Because guess what? If they didn't, they might, they probably would not be alive. And so we are descendants of survivors. We are descendants of warriors, you know. They had to work 10 times as hard. And I think something that we could do to honor them is live our life, enjoy those little moments because we are good enough.
Mhm.
We have been and we will always be.
That's such a beautiful message. And thank you for sharing that. Like you said, we're not being chased by that tiger necessarily. I was going to say colonization, but we still have a lot of systems that continue to
Oh yeah,
perpetrate colonization. But that's another
true.
podcast episode. We
Yeah.
do have a lot of opportunity to do healing and choose differently now. So, with that said, Christina, for folks that are interested in working with you, learning more about the healing work that you do, how can people connect with you and find you?
Well, they can connect with me through my LinkedIn. Also, I'll share with you my Calendly so that anyone that wants to have a conversation with me can schedule a 30-minute cafecito. I would love to know about your journey with burnout and tell you about the work that I'm doing and see if it's something that resonates with you and something that you would let me help you with.
Well, wonderful. Christina, thank you for joining me. And thank you also for listening, for tuning in. If you haven't left a review, please go ahead and leave a review. Let us know what you thought of this episode and other episodes that you've been listening to as well. And that's it. Okay, bye. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Rooted in Intention. Until next time, and remember to keep showing up for the life, relationships, and community you want. Now go, grow the life you want from the roots up.